everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this latest episode of our NewTube live discussion series. Today, we'll be talking about film, race, and archival absences. I'm Keelan Burke, Director of Fellowships and Academic Programs at the Newberry, and I'm here with Allyson Nadia Field, Associate Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. She's here at the Newberry this year on an ACLS Burkhardt Fellowship. Today, we will be talking about the history and afterlives of African American film, focusing on the rediscovery of early films with Black performers, like Something Good Negro Kiss from 1898, the challenges of the archive of early cinema, and the significance of race in early films today. Thanks very much, Allie, for joining us. For those of you who are joining us live on Facebook or YouTube, if you have a question, please write that question in the comments. To start with, I'd like to just go into a little bit of background on early cinema in general for those of us who may not be as familiar as you are. What counts as early, and can you give us a sense of what cinema would have looked like then? What would audiences have experienced or expected from going to see a film or a cinema experience?
Yeah. So the term early cinema is generally used by scholars to account for films made before 1915, broadly understood. But early cinema are films that were made in the 19th century. So motion pictures started to be made for public exhibition around 1895. And here are some examples that we'll put up to give you a sense of what these films were like. These are short, one-shot vignettes. Some of them are drawn from stage performances. Some are actualities, scenes of daily life. Some are these exotic scenes showing foreign locales or local locales or cities. All of them, to varying degrees, play up notions of motion. So part of the appeal of these films is to see something move, right? And see things that you wouldn't have access to otherwise, or you wouldn't see close up in your daily life. And so these were shown in a string of, since they're short subjects, they were shown kind of collated together. So they'd be shown kind of one after each other. And then eventually they were shown intermingled with vaudeville performances. And so there'd be both stage performances with live actors and motion pictures also, before motion pictures took over the world and vaudeville went the way of all things.
So thank you for sort of setting the scene for us on what this would have looked like in terms of what you were seeing and how you would have experienced it. And your first book, Uplift Cinema, The Emergence of African American Film and the Possibility of Black Modernity, focuses on that pre-1915 filmmaking. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the archival experience of researching early cinema looks like to you?
Yeah, I mean, the impetus for doing this book really came out of the recognition that I think there's a kind of misunderstanding of the history of Black cinema, broadly understood. That, and it was really important to me to write this book to really make the claim that African American cinema didn't start as a response to Birth of a Nation and other, racist films. But I argue that it's a wholly original engagement with moving pictures. And that they were used in the service of the Uplift Project, which is social and economic advancement of African Americans, in accordance with the philosophy of Booker T. Washington, who was one of the leading thinkers and kind of known as the representative man of the time. And these films took several forms. They were educational and sponsored films promoting uplift institutions like Tuskegee and Hampton Institutes. But they were also entrepreneurial films made by Black filmmakers as a business endeavor, who saw the film industry as another way to kind of promote economic advancement and independence. The challenge that you alluded to is that none of these films are known to survive, which is not really surprising given that most films from this era of filmmaking don't survive at all because of the fragility of the medium and the fact that they weren't considered important to preserve. But to access this history, we need to do more than just list titles of films that we knew were made. So, for example, as you can see here, you can look at adjacent media across the different kind of rhetorical strategies that these institutions and these filmmakers employed. So from photography to pageants, narratives, written narratives, things like that. And So for example, there was a rhetoric of kind of before and after that some of these schools that were using films employed in their images. So you see this before he came to Hampton and after. And the films did the same kind of thing. So thinking about what their structures were based on these sort of aesthetics of uplift that I talk about. And then we look for traces of how the film circulated and how they were received. So accessing Black newspapers, institutional records, any kind of surviving letters or documentation about the films. Now there's very, very scant evidence, but I treat them like clues to piece together this history and then mobilize informed speculation in the process of trying to composite an image of what uplift cinema looked like.
Thank you. I can imagine you, and I have a picture of you in like multiple archives, like pulling together little pieces of things that are going to tell that bigger story, and also kind of using your own expertise and knowledge in the areas to sort of weave that into a story and to a history. So one of those things that you have studied in the archives is the film Something Good, Negro Kiss. Can you tell us a little bit about the film itself and also about the process of how a film like this gets rediscovered, identified in an archive, how it comes into an archive? Weave us a little story around this particular film.
Yeah, so my wonderful colleague and friend, Dino Everett, who's the motion picture archivist at USC, one day he was going through some film fragments to prepare for a class, and he came across this film, these fragments that you see here, that he had acquired several years prior from a collector in New Orleans. And the fragment of this nitrate film really struck him for several reasons. The first is that in terms of the material, it was a direct first generation nitrate print. It wasn't a later dupe, which was in excellent condition, which is incredibly rare for something of this period. And then second, it featured what appeared to be this kind of non-caricatured representation of Black people laughing and kissing. So he sent me these scans, which you can see, and he asked me as a scholar of African-American cinema, does it seem important? And I said yes, to put it mildly. And together we really embarked on a 2-year process of identifying the film, dating it, and identifying the performers. So we were able to, through a combination of material evidence and extra filmic evidence from records and surviving papers, determine that it was made in Chicago by William Seelig in 1898. And it featured vaudeville performers Saint Subtle and Gertie Brown, who were part of a troupe called the Ragtime Four, who was touring around Chicago and the Midwest at the time. So we can look at the film if you like. And Dino restored it, and it's available. You can watch it on Vimeo. Just Google Something Good Negro Kiss and it comes up. And I think what you'll see that's so interesting is kind of this sort of tension. Can we play it? Can you play it, Alex? Yeah, there. Great, thanks. You can see the sort of tension between this kind of performativity of this couple that are dance partners, but also this sense of kind of almost coy embarrassment on her part. It seems a little bit improvised, that maybe the camera operator is kind of encouraging them to kiss again, and it's sort of this sort of impromptu thing, I think. At the same time, it's very much a performance. These are stage professionals. They're artistic workers. You know, this isn't kind of an unvarnished glimpse into like true love. This is a look at two professional performers doing their act in front of a camera, and that's very exciting to find.
It's sort of like the dream that a lot of people have of what working in archives is you find something that has never been discovered or hasn't been seen in a long time, and you get to dive into it. So so thank you for sharing that kind of background. I'll just give another brief intro for those of you who may be joining us now. I'm talking with Dr. Allyson Nadia Field about film, race, and archival absences. So having had discovered this, the rediscovery of this film, and also, so you dated it, you found the actors that were in it, you found where it was produced, you kind of filled in those gaps around it. Can you tell us now a little bit about how it was received, both kind of in a contemporary context, but also kind of what it illuminates in the history of early cinema?
Yeah, so I mean, it was very much a collaborative process that involved Dino, but also other archivists and experts, and who came forward with a lot of information that helped lead to the dating and the identification, especially of the performers. Once we were confident in the identification, we nominated the film to the National Film Registry, and it was added in December 2018. And then it was sort of catapulted to national and international attention because of all the news stories that were done around that. And then on social media, as you can see, there was a Twitter personality named Kyle Alex Brett who set the film to the soundtrack of Barry Jenkins' If Beale Street Could Talk, which was premiering that day. And from there, it really went viral. Celebrities picked it up from Jenkins on, and it got seen by millions of people, which is really rare for scholars and archivists to have an audience this large for our work. I think, on one order, it really touched people. It filled in this gap in visual history. It was something that folks had never seen before. But one thing that was really clear is how bittersweet that response also was. And as you can see here, Kyle also said, they seem so happy and I feel so angry, wondering what 1900 America did with that happiness. There were a lot of stories of grandparents falling in love, and this could have been my grandmother and she looked just like that, and that kind of thing. But then there was also this sort of tone of sadness. One commenter said, this country could have had this all along. Instead, it gets cursed with birth of a nation. So I think this was met really as a celebration, but also one that kind of pointed to the violence of misrepresentation that has really marked much of American cinema, and a kind of path. This film is like a path not taken, and so I think it was really moving for that.
Yeah, it seems like even just from that little snippet there, not just of the film, but of its response kind of on social media and more widely, that it obviously struck a very, struck a note for a lot of people. And now it's widely available.
And I think it's really shows how significant these historical artifacts and how they can resonate with people today. They can have this new life and touch people in a way that's very different than when they first emerged. And I find that really interesting to think about the afterlives of these rediscoveries.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of those afterlives are a piece of what you're looking at in your new project, but not exactly. So you're currently working on a new project titled Minstrel C, Vaudeville Cinema, though I hear there may be a new title in the works, American Popular Culture and Racialized Performance of Early Film. Can you tell us about kind of what led you to this project, and also maybe a little bit about how this film fits into this kind of where your research is taking you now?
Yeah, I mean, this film really made me think about, it was unlike anything I'd seen in early cinema where racist representation is so pervasive. And it made me think like, what are we missing? The film, when it came out, was marketed as a burlesque or a parody of the famed May Irwin Kiss, which you can see here on the upper left, which Edison produced in 1896. And it was the most popular film to be shown in Edison's Vitascope. And so Something Good Negro Kiss is a parody of it. But what's not well known is that Irwin herself, May Irwin, was a minstrel performer. She didn't perform in blackface or in costumed as a black character, but she was known for what was called coon shouting, which was a genre of ragtime where white women sing in the persona of black men, sometimes women. But her signature song was this bully song that she sang in the play, The Widow Jones, that the Kiss film is an excerpt from. And in that song, she sings in the persona of a threatening black man. And it's a crazy song. You can hear it on the Library of Congress National Jukebox site if you're interested. But I argue in my work that what Saint Subtle and Gertie Brown are doing in Something Good Negro Kiss is in effect exposing Irwin's racial masquerade, making visible what was hidden in plain sight. The fact that the May Irwin Kiss is a minstrel kiss and is already this raced performance. So the book then takes this as sort of an invitation to reconsider the emergence of American film at the turn of the 20th century as imbricated with minstrelsy and vaudeville in what I'm calling, these racialized performances. part of the viral circulation of Something Good Negro Kiss was that it led to more discoveries. More people saw that we were working on this, and archivists said, oh, we have something like that in our archive, and it led to other things, including the National Library of Norway, as you can see here on the top, found another version of Something Good Negro Kiss, which is like lightning striking twice. You have this amazing archival rediscovery and then another one. And we can look at it now, and I can kind of talk about what makes it so amazing. It's a long, fuller body shot. They're full figures, so you get a much more sense of how they move with one another, and they're clearly acting, right? This is part of their stage performance, and this is clearly part of their act. Maybe they're acting out a song, maybe it's a skit, but you really get a sense of what their stage presence was like. And also the fun that they're having with the kiss, which we see in the first version of Something Good Negro Kiss. But put together, you really get to see them as professionals. And I think that's really powerful and really important to think about this as not just kind of a glimpse into the past, but as something that is recording what a performance might have looked like. And it's also just really charming.
The spin at the end is just like gives you kind of goosebumps to see that sort of delight, even if it is a particular performance, but they are embodying that performance so well. So this is a question that, so you've talked about Minstrel C, vaudeville cinema. You talked about how in early cinema, there would have been, cinema and performances, there would have been film and vaudeville and all those things put together. For those of us in the audience, and those of us like myself who is not as familiar with this time, this particular area and of kind of cultural performance, can you just tease that out a little bit for us and give us a little bit more about what Minstrel C, what vaudeville, and what cinema? I mean, obviously those would have been kind of, performance genres, but how they kind of worked together and how you're thinking of them together.
Yeah, so Minstrel C is a very big term that I think has different connotations for us than it did historically and at different historical periods. So it originally referred to a particular performance show that had a strict structure that was based on earlier kind of masquerades of Blackness by mostly Irish performers. Eric Lott has written a really important book called Love and Theft that kind of traces the history of this from the early 19th century on. Now we think about it more as this kind of, these moments that erupt in where you find like politicians who in college wore blackface and people talk about that as minstrelsy too. What I'm talking about here are performers who were identified as minstrel performers, that they used the stage, that was their sort of platform, and that they were Black performers who kind of took this white imagined notion of Blackness and turned it on its head. And it was at one point an entree onto the stage and a kind of point of access, but it was also a platform to kind of undermine some of the racist presumptions of these performances in the white imaginary. And so I find it really interesting how it gets used by Black performers who I think are making a commentary, as I just said about May Irwin, on the kind of white abuse of the sort of racial masquerade. What happens is that then on the vaudeville stage, these become kind of acts that are just there along with other acts, juggling, burlesque, dancing, all kinds of things. And then you get either white performers in blackface, or sometimes Black performers as well, doing a variety of different kinds of performance. But if we think about the vaudeville stage as sort of a variety stage, and then motion pictures being one aspect of that variety, I'm really interested in how these things are kind of talking to each other. And I'll talk about, how the Newberry comes into that in a second, but that these genres that I think historically think of very discreetly, I'm arguing that, at this moment, at the beginning of cinema becoming a form of mass entertainment, that it's completely imbricated with vaudeville, which we know because a lot of stage performers ended up on screen, but that minstrelsy is really pervasive as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful in sort of thinking about how these different genres or different kinds of performance would have been experienced at the time. For those of you who are joining us live on Facebook or YouTube, if you have any questions, I'm here with Professor Allyson Nadia Field talking about film, race, and the archival absences. You can pop your questions into the comments. So Ali, you had just mentioned sort of the different pieces of this project, but also you are here at the Newberry doing research and work on this project. Why is the Newberry a good place for you to do this? What do we have in our collections that helps you speak to those archival absences that you come across in your research, or kind of putting the pieces together?
Yeah, I mean, part of, if we talk about the kind of this absent archive of a lot of films are lost, and we don't have records about a lot of these performers or even filmmakers, that part of the work is looking adjacently at the broader cultural context of that these filmmakers and films were circulating in. And the Newberry is really a treasure trove for that. So this is just one example, but one of the figures that I'm interested in, deeply interested in, is this guy named William Foster, who's considered the first Black filmmaker. He was making films in Chicago in the teens. But before that, he had been involved with managing minstrel troupes, with working in a vaudeville theater. He was one of the managers of the Pekin Theater, which is on the Chicago South Side. It's the first Black-owned theater in the US. And he also owned a music shop and was a music publisher. And so here we have just a couple examples of things that I think are really, that help me composite his career out of the kind of archival ephemera at the Newberry. So he published Shelton Brooks's Some of These Days, which was a hit song. And if you look really, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but on the bottom left, it does say that this was initially copyrighted by William Foster. He sold the rights. And of course, the day after he sold it to Will Rossiter, Rossiter got an order for like 1 million copies of the song, and he became rich, and Foster did not. So they're all tracing all of that through the Driscoll sheet music collection. And there's the tremendous treasure trove of sheet music at the Newberry has been really interesting. And there are many copies of this particular song, Some of These Days, with different performers highlighted. So that kind of rose figure in the bottom right square changes for each iteration of this. And that's really interesting to see who was singing this song and how it circulated. Foster made these kind of comedies, Black cast comedies in the teens. And his most famous one was called The Railroad Porter. Film doesn't survive. We have accounts from it from the paper. And we know that he also had ambitions to show it to interracial audiences and in major vaudeville houses. And so one of the places that he was able to screen the film was at the Majestic Theater in the Loop. This was like Chicago's premier vaudeville house. And what the Newberry has are the original programs. And so we know what night it was shown, and we can see what else was on the program that night. What was the film shown up against? So even if the program doesn't list him, we can see what audience members might have encountered that night that they went to the theater and saw his film. So I find that really interesting to use these pieces from the archive to then invite a kind of form of speculation into thinking about how the films operated in the kind of broader context. And then you flash forward to the late 20s. He was someone who was very steeped in Chicago's theater world, Black theater world. And in 1928, he published his Memoirs of the Stage in this official theatrical world of colored artists, which says 1928 edition. There was no 1929 or 1930 edition. This was it. And his memoirs don't talk about films, unfortunately, but he talks about stage performers and the theatrical world of the time. And it's really fascinating. And this is on microfilm at the Newberry, so that's why it looks a little funny. But so finding all these little pieces and kind of thinking about just through this one figure, you can, yeah, hopefully piece together more about how we might understand someone like Foster. So that's just an example.
So what you're really saying is that Chicago's at the center of all of this, and we should all be talking about Chicago.
We should all be talking about Chicago. I mean, I'm not the first to make that argument. My colleague Jacqueline Stewart wrote a book about filmmaking in Chicago, but really Chicago is the epicenter of Black cinema and the emergence of Black cinema as a theatrical enterprise. And that's, that's one of the wonderful things about being here, is that this is so much part of the culture. And I think it's a history that really hasn't widely been known. And hopefully, the Newbery is a major part of that, and we can change that.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting. I love to see that the different ways and different parts of the collection that kind of speak to each other and speak to a project. I know you mentioned the Driscoll sheet music collection. For those of you who are watching, most of those are digitized and available on our website. So if you want to, to page through some of those with a little bit of distance before you come into the Newbery, we also have them for you to look at in person. But yeah, so like the programs, the microfilms, the sheet music, all of the different ways that you can get at to the stories that you're, the subjects that you're looking at. So it's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing both the process and some of the product of what you've been working on today. We have another minute or two. If anybody has any questions, you can put that into the comments. If not, I'll give that a moment, but I'll say thank you to Ally for joining us. It has been wonderful to talk to you about the work that you have been doing and the work that you are now doing. Are there any do you have any other favorite film clips or other things that you would love to just sort of shine a light on to, besides the ones that you're talking about, that we've talked about already today, that we can put in a plug for before we wrap up today?
I mean, there's other material. As I said, the fact that the Something Good Negro Kiss went viral has led to other rediscoveries. One of them is actually a fragment held at the Library of Congress of the Ragtime Four performing a cakewalk, which I don't have queued up to show you, but I can tell you what's amazing about it is you actually get to see this quartet perform. So I said lightning struck twice, it actually struck 3 times because we get 3 films featuring these performers, which I mean is really unheard of. So that's very exciting. And then I think just re-looking at a lot of these films that I think we thought as a discipline and as a culture, we knew, I think we've thought of this sort of, even in the frame of like primitive cinema and all these racist representations, and it's not worth kind of re-looking at. I really think it's important to look again and I think it's important to confront our past and the egregious racist representation that did exist, and also understand it as how we might see these moments of resilience and resistance through performers like Saint Settle and Gertie Brown.
Thank you. So now we will also send you to the Library of Congress website in addition to the Newbery's website. We have
that's
one
not
question.
online. Yeah,
that's not online. You'll have to go to the Library of Congress to actually see it in person. There is one question we have from the audience that someone has asked, what do you think about TMC channels putting a modern contextual spin on older movies?
I mean, I think it's really great. I think that's, really important. I think giving a framing, I think one thing we've learned is that images don't speak for themselves, that they require, and films don't speak for themselves, and that they're deeply historicized documents and artifacts, and that in order to understand them, we need to have that framing. I mean, if I showed you the May Irwin Kiss, you would sort of shrug and say, oh, it's some dowdy old people, middle-aged people kissing. But you need to have that kind of sense of framework to understand that, how we could understand these as race bodies. And so I think what TCM is doing is really important. I understand there's a lot of resistance to that, but I think it enriches our appreciation of cinema. It doesn't detract from it. So I'm in full favor of it.
Thank you. So now you can go to TCM and watch movies with more context too. We're giving you all sorts of other exciting things to do here today. We have one last question, and this one is a little bit more specific about one of the films you mentioned earlier. So you talked about the Railroad Porter as a film that is one of those many, many lost films. But there's a question is asking about, is there any documentation that kind of gives you a synopsis of the film at least?
Oh,
do we have an idea of what it was? And can you tell us?
Sure, you can also read my book. But no, the Railroad Porter is fascinating, and this is another place where I've gone to the Newbery to see. So it's a story about a railroad porter who goes out on his run, and while he's away, his wife entertains a fashionably dressed chap who and serves him the delicacies of the season. This is from the synopsis. And then the porter comes back unexpected and catches wifey engaged in these delicacies. And a chase ensues, and it's comedic, and then revolvers are drawn, but all ends well. So that's the synopsis. I think what's interesting, what historians have been really interested in, is how this showcases the professions that were available to African Americans at the time: railway porters, the waiter, who's this fashionably dressed chap, who also comes from who's a well-known figure from one of the local cafes on the south side of Chicago, who would have been recognizable to audiences. So it's really about the community, but also drawing comedy from this kind of intraracial sphere. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is go through all the Pullman Porter records, which are held at the Newberry, to see if there was any sense that the Pullman Company was aware of this, what they thought about it. But those records are a little bit later, and the film was a sensation in 1913. But The Messenger, I think, doesn't begin until 1917, something like that. So I've yet to find any accounts from Pullman porters about this. But there's a lot of, the Chicago Defender reported on it. Foster was also a reporter for the Defender, so there was a lot of boosterism going on, which is great for historians because there's a lot of documentation, but the film itself doesn't survive.
Thank you. And now we will also point watchers to your book to learn more about the Railroad Porter, or again, to the Newberry to delve through the Pullman Porter archives yourself if you are so interested. So, well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon to talk about film, race, and archival absences with Professor Allyson Nadia Field. And thank you, Allie, very much for joining us. This has been absolutely wonderful to get to talk to you about your work. And I look forward to seeing where it goes from here and reading the next book.